Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. With me, as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. And today we boldly go to a very unusual place out there in space with our TOS crew, Captain Kirk and the like, as we explore bits of history in a new and unusual way. Which, again, rubs us up against that Prime Directive in all the wrong and uncomfortable ways. But I don't want to give away too much, because I'm sure our resident expert, Fert Derby, has a lot of interesting things to say. Fert Derby, take us away.
Thanks, Trekkies, from all four quadrants of the galaxy. Welcome to the Warp Core. Welcome to Star Trek Patterns of Force, which debuted on February 16th of 1968. We have director Vincent McKeevety, and we had as a writer John Meredith Lucas. With regards to Mr. McKeevety, he did 3 episodes for Trek. This is his first episode for season 2, but he did 3 season 1 episodes, and we've discussed them here on the Warp Core podcast. You're going to want to check your archives for these descriptions of his craft. In season 1, he actually did back-to-back episodes. He did Miri. You'll recall when Kirk and the others were meeting those lovable scamps in an apocalyptic town. So Mr. McKeevety did Miri, which we talked about in Warp Core 33. We also talked about Dagger of the Mind in Warp Core 33. So if you want a full analysis of what we thought of his work, you're definitely going to want to go back to the archives and get episode 33. He also did Balance of Terror, which was the submarine-inspired battle with the Romulans, and we talked about that in Warp Core 35. So he's got a few under his belt. He's not like our returning champions, Joseph Pevney and Mark Daniels, but he knows his way around the bridge, and he can find his way to the transporter room without directions. Thank you very much. John Meredith Lucas, we talked about. He actually quietly, mid-season 2, replaced Gene L. Kuhn as a co-showrunner and producer. Gene L. Kuhn stepped back, took on just more of a writing function, and he'll have a couple more episodes to share with us between now and the series end. But John Meredith Lucas basically took over and worked with DC Fontana and Roddenberry for the second half as a producer, executive producer, showrunner, co-showrunner. And he was also writing. And he had done 1 episode as a writer before he took on the additional responsibilities. And that was The Changeling, which I believe we covered in Warp Core 45. As you recall, I believe that was the one where there was and you'll definitely want to check the archives there. I think that was the robot probe that actually wiped Uhura's memory and had echoes of Star Trek the Motion Picture and V'ger and so forth. And I believe we said fond things about the Changeling early on in season 2, one of the high points so far for the second season. So Mr. Lucas has also been around the galaxy, so to speak, and this is his second scripted episode, Patterns of Force. One final note, because of the frequency of the references, the Nazi and his symbols, direct references to the Fuhrer and the final solution and all of this, episode was German television. It never properly premiered in 1968, and it was banned all the way through to 1995. So if you were a Trekkie fan in West Germany, East Germany, on either side of the wall, before the wall came down and after, you could not actually see this on German television. And then, just like those bricks were crumbled, in the mid-90s, they finally first released it on home video and then finally started broadcasting it on television with the other Trek reruns. So, and that was par for the course. They didn't just single out this particular episode, but in general, they didn't feel it was a good idea to be putting Nazis back into the bloodstream. And that leads me to kind of the big overarching note for this episode is we have to kind of remind ourselves, whether it was Hogan's Heroes or Linda Carter's Wonder Woman or, any of the combat World War II television shows, including combat, that, being a Nazi on television, especially when you win World War II, they were kind of characterized for years in the Western field as, buffoons or cartoon-like villains or ones that we knew would be easily thwarted, the jackboots of fascism stamped out. And I think, even Steven Spielberg will tell you that in his first, 2/3 of the Raiders films that he did in the 1980s, that the Nazis were a convenient villain, comic book like, hissable, and so forth. It wasn't actually, I think, until we started getting, Schindler's List, the more recent Zone of Interest, the harrowing Son of Saul, when we started to sort of, really focus. We had the Shoah documentaries and foundation established in the late 80s. It wasn't until we really took an unflinching eye towards the atrocities and the horrors of Nazi Germany and what they were doing, and we kind of absorbed that into the bloodstream, that then it became sort of less appetizing to, just use them as punchlines and so forth. So when this episode aired, I mean, it may shock us to see like the flagrant, white supremacy and power and all of that, and the casual ease of spitting out, fascist slogans and so forth. But that was par for the course, is what I'm saying. Like, there wasn't that sense, that self-reflection, that deep emotional resonance in a entertainment perspective yet. We were, oh, these are monsters, so let's make fun of them and cut them down to size and reduce them, I think was the general feeling. And so in that spirit, it absolutely makes sense. Like, this is not supposed to be a controversial Star Trek episode. You could do this with, Nazi Germany and Nazi imagery and references to the Fuhrer, and people just went with it. But I think just now in the last 35, 40 years, as we've come, fully to grips with some of the atrocities and horrors that weren't necessarily out there in the sphere, as forwarded as they have been, before, and having the survivors come forward and record their testimonials and so forth. I think now you might just pause before you characterize them as such easy marks. And so I think that's important to watch with that perspective for this episode. It's not Star Trek just, flying its fascist flag. This was, like I say, this was more generalized entertainment, and they just made for a really hissable villain. And that's, and you have to take it in that appropriate there. So, and I was surprised, I was surprised at how hissable, they actually were in this episode. I was, they made no bones about it, although Bones had trouble getting into the SS uniform. He struggles with his boots and so forth. But yeah, that was my main note, was that it was, like I say, the Hogan's Heroes, I see nothing, Colonel Klink and all of that. Oh, those lovable Germans, we'll fool them again from the prison camp. That and Wonder Woman, using them. I think they had Nazi guerrillas in an episode of, they were like, super strong guerrillas trained by the SS, and they battled Wonder Woman and she wrestled with one. And I mean, it's a little silly now, honestly. But like I say, I think it took several years, several decades before the tide had shifted ever so slightly, and then we had a more fuller appreciation of some of that. Sulu, they must have had reshoots on Green Berets because he's gone again. Or else, in addition to his long simmering resentments of William Shatner. Maybe he's got something with Walter going now. I mean, I have no idea. But let's get those two back on the helm together for an episode. Is that too much to ask? Because I don't believe Chekhov was featured upon Sulu's triumphant return and Return to Tomorrow, which we cover here on the Warp Core podcast, episode 58. You'll definitely want to check that one out. But overall, gentlemen, I mean, we had some classic Lord Uther tropes. We had shirtless Shatner. We had shirtless Nimoy, who's Vulcans are quite hirsute. And I mean, I say that, simply by contrast, because the captain is as smooth as a baby's bottom. And Nimoy, he's got some impressive chest hair. Not Robin Williams, Alec Baldwin chest hair, but enough to make you say, yeah, this is stuff here. They also had like some crazy makeup. They didn't go with blood or anything that resembled blood. It was more like they took lipstick and just smeared it on Shatner's back, and Nimoy unfortunately had green paint, I'm sure, for his Vulcan blood there. We had a lot of nerve pinches and mind melts. There was a lot of Vulcan defense and offensive methods used in this episode. The most, I think, in a single episode we have to date, and so forth. And it was, gentlemen, I want to say that, this could have been cringy. This could have been off kilter. This may have clashed with more modern sensibilities. But if you're looking at it as an hour of science fiction television, the messaging, the ultimate solutions and so forth, that they strive to kind of undo the damage to the Prime Directive, even Captain Kirk directing a film crew, which just screams straight out of TMZ with, here, get that light. Put it right over here. It worked. It worked for me. We'll go over the Warp Core ratings later, but I may have had my trepidations, but I think the episode, for the most part, answers all of those. Where do you gentlemen come down on patterns of force?
Urza, do you mind if I just jump in?
Oh, you take it away.
Just real quick. Thanks. First of all, speaking of shirtless people, you're one step away right now. I mean, I appreciate you jumping on board with Shatner and Nimoy and getting as close to shirtless as possible. It is fantastic. For all our viewers, please just take a moment, bask in the glow.
Near nudity.
And know,
semi-nudity.
And know that Fert Derby is dedicated to your podcast to the point of almost looking like Bill Shatner. I was actually kind of surprised. They went kind of deep on the Nazi thing. I mean, the final solution piece, calling them Zeons, which is close to Zionist. I mean, like, everything that they were hailing, doing the Heil Hitler the whole time, they kind of went for it in a sense, even giving it more of a serious tone. It's not like watching a Hogan's Heroes and doing a Heil Hitler. Like, they kind of went for it here, which, if you think about it, just historically, it's timely in the sense that a lot of people watching that would be able to relate to it to a certain point or understand the depth that goes with doing something like that or bringing up Nazism in general. So, I think that just would stick with the viewer, right? And I think using Nazis, whether it's this or like Raiders, and I talk to my students about this a lot too, they're evil no matter what. Like, you can't find any piece of a Nazi and be like, I kind of get it. Like, you just can't. They're always the bad guy. There's no two ways about it. There's no you could look at a lot of different countries or peoples historically and maybe be able to shift away from them being the bad guy in a sense. But you can never argue with the Nazi, not being a bad guy. They're always the bad guy. So there's some that you can go against, and when you think of that, it automatically equates with bad guy, which is something that Lucas does, right? In Star Wars, which, if you listen to the Graying Jedi podcast, It's a perfect segue there, too. They're called stormtroopers for a reason. And he called them stormtroopers because you could go back and relate that to Nazi Germany. So you knew right away that stormtroopers were bad guys in Star Wars, at least for the first three, right? Like they were always bad guys no matter what. There was going to be a side to them that was going to be redeeming. So he kind of goes there as well. I love your point about people passing out in this episode because I can't remember the one guy's name. Is it Eneg or something? Who's kind of he puts a guy like this, a chokehold for a half a second, and the guy just goes down. So I need to learn that chokehold because it's right up there with the Vulcan nerve pinch. And even at one point, the film crew, Shatner is so close to the girl. She's standing up against the edge of a doorway, and her head is almost completely up against it because he's like this close to her with the camera. He was right there. But yes, this episode could have gone in a bad, and it's funny because I think we've said this the past couple episodes. This could have gone down a bad path and been a total crash and burn, or an Enterprise burn back into orbit. That's a whole nother Warp Core episode, which you can find right here on Pending Rebrand. With over 600 episodes now, or 600 videos. That's, again, but I digress. Excellent episode. Worked for me, and hopefully works for UrzaMaster as well.
It was great, and I think it touched on a few things that I think is important from a historical perspective. One, I think it's a fantastic tropey science fiction thing because the Nazis and science fiction are about as tied together as anything can possibly be. Mostly because Nazi Germany was very interested in the supernatural, UFOs, really anything science fiction kind of grew out of Nazi Germany. It was sort of a response to all the weird stuff that they were doing, and that invaded the psyche of late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s into today even. You still see some of this out there with their flirtation with science, technology, and trying to bridge that gap between supernatural, ancient history, all that. Tons of fascinating stuff. And there's no short range on content there. You could go on that route forever. But they touched on the Fuhrer being drugged, heavily drugged, which Hitler, very well-known morphine addict, very well-known drug addict, not defending him in any way, it's just how he fueled himself outside of his speeches. He was addled, absolutely addled, and this kind of gave them sort of an easy way to explain how a proud citizen of the Federation could become corrupted. You know, a history teacher, somebody who should know better. How could this have happened? Well, he stumbled across, and he says it in the episode, this is a planetary system in a really bad way. They were essentially the Weimar Republic, falling apart as a society, and they needed the most efficient way to crawl out of that. And the most efficient way was Nazi Germany. They were the only modern society to elevate themselves from the deepest deep of the Depression in a very, very short amount of time. Now, of course, that came at heavy sacrifice for a lot of people. So it's not defending that at all. It's just to say that, yeah, that is one way to quickly remediate a state that's falling apart. But you skirt that line. And it didn't take much for power to corrupt. And it didn't take many drugs to kind of push the cart down the hill, so to speak. So I thought that was really potent. I mean, especially for the era, to have that recognition of, like, that Nazi Germany did, and this was a very popular belief at the time, that the Nazis did a lot of right things. They just went very far off the rails of the ride, so to speak. And historically speaking, you can't really argue that point. I mean, they did do some amazing things that had nothing to do with their atrocities, that did lift Germany out of the worst period of human history up until that point, minus the Great War, perhaps, at least in the modern sense. So if you were a historian, this becomes very plausible. So I mean, science fiction is always rooted in a plausible story. This would stand to reason, especially in the mindset of the era. Now, there was a lot not known, particularly amongst the general public, about what actually happened in those years. I mean, there was stuff that was out there, but you got to remember that there was no internet. People knew about Nazi Germany from books and teachers, and it could easily be corrupted by point of view. You know, we have a lot more information freely available these days, so it's very easy to say that there is no redeeming quality of Nazi Germany. But at the time, there were a lot of people who were like, was it really that bad? Because they were just in blissful ignorance. And this was a way to highlight that it was really that bad. And despite the fact that there was some efficiency to it and some gains that could be made, the possibility of falling into a state like this, not worth the trade. And that's the ultimate lesson here, which I think is pretty amazing for Star Trek. I mean, you think about some of the moral stories and the societal commentary that we've had. We've had commentary on Vietnam. We've had commentary on exploration and, Prime Directive, don't interfere with a primitive race. Now you're really getting modern, especially for the era, modern commentary on don't take the easy way out to rebuild a society in need, because you flirt that line of completely corrupting them and then leading to something like this. That's extraordinarily deep for TV from Desilu at this juncture in 1968. I think you get a lot of interesting information here too about how convenient it is to fool Nazis, because they would be used to sort of the Gestapo-esque follow around your icons with the camera, get the perfect shot, get the perfect this or that for propaganda purposes. That would be totally normal. I mean, it seems like a very convenient, well, how in the hell are they getting around with all these lights and a camera? That would be normal. Totally normal.
Hitler purposefully, he was the first one to have a minister of propaganda, and he hired a film director to shoot all of his speeches, and they were making those. They were the first ones to ever do that, to get it out into the populace. And I love what you're saying too, especially at the end, right, where he's like, "Stop the final salute. This has to stop. There's a traitor amongst us," and everyone's just like, "Oh yeah, okay, if that's what you say," because, like you're saying, everyone followed what their superior said to them. There was no questioning it. Yeah. So the way that ending goes about could have been accurate, which almost brings up a what if in a sense. I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, that's an excellent point. Because it does feel a little convenient, but you have to remember that they were Nazi Germany was eating out of the hand of Hitler, and it's the same thing in this episode. So it could have been so easy to undo a lot of this damage. Now, it would have never, ever, 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 ever in real life happened that way. But from a storytelling perspective in an episode of Star Trek, it does track 100%. And I think what's interesting here is that from a perspective of what you've seen of Nazis on TV, like a Hogan's Heroes or Wonder Woman, this is probably the first time you get actually a pretty accurate picture outside of like actual historical documentary or classroom type stuff. Even though there's some goofy, tropey things, there's the pretty blonde. Of course, there's lots of pretty blondes, but it's really it's poignant. It's poignant in a way that is almost odd for Star Trek of the era. And the only thing that I think cheapens out how impactful of an episode this really was is when you get to the end and you get that goofy music at the end of it. And they had to throw that in there because it had to be that Shakespearean comedic break. You've really just watched a pretty heavy episode of Star Trek. You've seen torture, you've seen Nazis, you've seen, a struggle for a struggle against genocide in a very real way. I mean, you didn't see anything on screen necessarily that was all that egregious, but the implication there, and this is very close to what was on the forefront of everybody's mind, particularly at the height of the Vietnam War, which was devastating enough, very much on TV. There are a lot of folks recalling the horrors of World War II and potentially even World War One with Vietnam, and it's like, this is really punching you in the gut hard, this episode. Even though some of the stuff is kind of, cheeky and, campy, Kirk and Spock get caught and then tortured. A lot of stuff goes sideways. Like, this episode does not go off conveniently. Even when McCoy shows up, he's having trouble with his boot, and then they get caught in the closet. Like, there's a lot of, like, oh crap moments that, I think they had to almost give you a bit of a diffuser at the end to kind of be like, all right, you can relax. Like, this is, everything, there was a happy ending. Everything's going to be fine. And it's because, like, it carries an emotional punch. I mean, even today, you can sort of feel it as you're watching it, like, yeesh, like, this is pretty raw. And some of the people involved in this episode likely fought in World War II or were children at the time that would have remembered all this stuff really, really, really well.
Yes.
So I think this is one of those Star Trek original series episodes.
The Warp Core
really
ratings, which we like to
I'm really surprised they made
with
it.
every week to tell us how we felt
I'm
our
really
episode.
surprised that
I'll lead off and
released,
set the table
alone,
for you gentlemen to see where it stands.
Did get was so narrow.
I'm going to give this one. I'm going to give this one a 6. I'm going to give it a 6 as a Star Trek episode because I think this is the kind of show that Star Trek wants to be doing, to try and take a story, make it topical or relatable in some fashion, force us, hold up a mirror to society, to our human flaws and the capacities for darkness that we all carry within us, and then try to wrestle with the answers. And so I think this is if all Star Treks were able to follow that blueprint to that degree and be effective in it, then the show might have gone on for 20 seasons, the original series, and not just 3. And I think in later incarnations of the shows, they were able to strike that balance. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Strange New Worlds. I think they've only improved upon the original model. But as far as what Star Trek wants to be doing, I have my problems with the episode, but I think if you just look at it as what is the messaging that Star Trek should be trying for each and every week, I feel like this is a very representative episode of what a Star Trek episode should be. And for that, it's going to earn those plaudits. And anything I had, the discomfort of seeing, the Nazis up close or within that, acknowledge them. And I like I say, it's not how I would write it, or maybe the Strange New Worlds crew would write it today. But I understand where it belongs on the continuum, and so like I say, it's a strong Star Trek episode.
Oh. I'm toying with the 6.5, but I'll go 6 as well. I think 7s now have to be, well, there's one element I was kind of hoping for, but it didn't happen, which was I'd like to see some kind of a space battle at some point, but I'm also a space battle guy, or see the Enterprise utilized a little bit more, I guess. But anyway, yeah, I'm gonna go 6. Great episode. I mean, one that should be watched, but I don't think it's exactly on the point of perfection. Again, and I know it's the time period, but the goofy music to get the jokes across. But this is a heavy episode. Just yeah, that's one thing that kind of pushes me away just a little bit. And but man, to get Leonard Nimoy with no shirt on, hello.
I'm going to go 6 as well to round out the perfect number for the Nazis. Yeah, 6 out of 7 warp cores. I think it's an unexpectedly great episode of Star Trek. That being said, I think I have some difficulties with how they could have done it differently. That prevents it from being a perfect score. And I think that's where Strange New Worlds was successful, where Captain Pike beams down in between the two parties of the world that are about to tear each other apart and shows him, hey, this is, our World War III. This is what tore our society apart. You all are right there. You're about to destroy each other. And gives that fantastic soliloquy. That is the one thing that I think was missing from this episode that would have made it perfect, is somehow Kirk is the one who steps in and saves the day. I know that seems a little tropey, but I think that's where they would have had the opportunity to make a stance or a speech against Nazis in a very real way that could have been more transformative. Now, of course, got to put in perspective here, that is pre-Prime Directive. That is actually why we have the Prime Directive, as Captain Pike's little speech. But I think, they already circumnavigated the Prime Directive in this episode. Like, why wouldn't you? So it's not good enough for a 6.5, and it's definitely not a 7. I don't think it could be rated worse either. This is one of those episodes that it's not foundational, but it's a must-see. And if you did not see it, go out and check it out. It is streaming on Paramount Plus. But I digress. Until next time, I will leave you all with a live long and prosper.